Good morning, everyone. Hey, Sven. Hey, Nathan.
Good to be here, Fraser.
Nice. This is session 3 of Removing the Barriers to Belief. Welcome if you're just joining us. We have just kicked off, so it's good to have you with us. And now, Sven, you well? You rested? You ready to go?
I am. I no longer look like I'm in a dungeon. You can see the room behind me.
Nice. How about you, Nate? Oh, I might just need you to reconnect your audio again. Either that or you're miming really well. Morning, folks. Marina, Susanna, Coral, and Doug, good to have you with us. Hey, if you're joining us, love you to jump on the chat and just say hi. Let us know where you're from. We know some of you are joining us from Melbourne, and we've had guests from Canada and Brisbane. So do jump on the chat and engage. This is something where we want to interact with you and want to hear your voice and make sure you have your say as well. Look, while Nathan's rejoining us, I might ask Sven just to give us a bit of a recap of what you've looked at over the last 2 sessions. So we kicked off on Thursday night, and Thursday night we looked at Does God Exist? Sven, tough challenge here, but in 10 seconds, what did you talk about?
Okay, so on Thursday night we looked at Does God Exist? And we looked at 5 lines of evidence. The origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of genetic information, the foundation for objective moral values and duties, and also the resurrection of God. And all of those lines of evidence point towards the existence of God.
Okay.
I think that was 10 seconds.
That was good. That was good. You made it.
Made it.
Definitely fit in. And then Nathan, you followed that up. Have we got your audio? Yes.
Is the audio going good now?
Fantastic.
We can hear you. Awesome.
Excellent. Yeah. So piggybacking off Sven there, assuming that we have a requirement for evil and suffering in God, I had a look at how could it be that there could be an all-powerful, loving God given the existence of suffering and evil in the world. And we found that when you bring up the problem of evil, there's an automatic requirement for a problem of time. So we looked at whether time could somehow make sense of this, and we specifically looked at a story to identify a hero in the time delay that we all are wondering about.
Wow. Yeah, it was Thursday night was good. And what I'm going to do, folks, I'll pop the link to Thursday's session in the comments shortly. It's on YouTube, so you can catch that. And then last night, session 2, Sven, you took us on a journey, and you just want to give us a bit of see if you can do it again, 10-second recap of what you looked at last night.
Okay, so set your timers. Here we go. So we looked at did Jesus rise from the dead? And we followed prophetic or predictions from the Hebrew scriptures from hundreds of years before Jesus. And then we looked at 4 facts: that Jesus was buried in a senator's grave, that his tomb was found empty, that there were appearances of Jesus, and then there was also the fact that the disciples publicly proclaimed his resurrection. And we compared the biblical explanation that he rose from the dead with naturalistic explanations, alternatives, and we found that the biblical explanation still remains to be the best.
All right. Yeah, it was a good topic, raised some interesting discussion as well. And that kind of went straight into Nathan's session, which was looking at this question, and I've heard this quite a bit. Christianity claims that Jesus is the only way to God. And one of the comments was, hey, well, what gives you guys the right, what gives you the exclusivity to this? Nathan, what's your summary of last night's session?
I think that's a really good question and a really hard one to give justice quickly. But I think what we can say is in our society today, it's not really considered to be appropriate to be making claims of hierarchy. My position's better than yours or whatever else. But we looked at a particular story about an aeroplane going missing in South Australia to find out that at least in some areas of life, there is one right answer. Not all the time, not everywhere, but in some aspects of life, there is one right answer. So the question was, with regards to connecting to God, is Jesus the one and only right answer, or is it an arrogant claim that can be gainsaid? And I gave 4 factual reasons and 4 heart reasons, plus a bonus 9th point why I believe Jesus is the only way to God. Happy to take it on notice. I invited questions this morning to follow up. If you got anything better, I'm very eager.
Yes, and folks, Nathan, Sven, and I were really keen for your feedback and your engagement. If, as Sven's going to kick off shortly, with this idea of has science buried God? And as we're going through, if you've got a question, just pop it in the chat, and we will have a pretty good time of Q&A at the end of Sven's presentation, where you'll have a chance to ask your question and he'll respond. And yeah, this is to help you and to just guide you in the questions and the responses that you're after. So Sven Östring, joining us from Newcastle. You've got an interest in science and the natural world. So this is going to be an interesting session, because a lot of people do say, hey, well, science is evidence-based and it's empirical and it's testable. It's in a separate realm to faith, and so the two are incompatible. And so I'm looking forward to what you have to share with us this morning, and how we can maybe reconcile that, or how do we approach this challenge of science and faith. So we'll hand over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Fraser. And Nathan, we look forward to your presentation as well. Has science buried God? A fascinating question. And so what I want to do is take you back to Thursday night. Fraser introduced me to you. And one of the things I really love is science. Just looking out there at the universe, it fills you with this incredible awe. And it really is amazing. I grew up in Hong Kong, as I mentioned on Thursday night. And in Hong Kong, as you would know, recently there have been many riots, many protests about freedom. But when I was growing up in Hong Kong, there was none of this turmoil at that time. And one of the things I really remember about living in Hong Kong was often going to the airport to fly overseas. And that was often back to Australia or to New Zealand, or at times to England and Sweden, and even to the United States. And I guess this is where Nathan and my interest overlap in another area. I love planes, I love flying. Nathan's taken a lot further than I have. He's a pilot. But when I was a teenager, I was dreaming of becoming an aeronautical engineer. But we'd often go to the airport, and we'd be sitting there in the terminal looking out at these magnificent 747 planes waiting to fly somewhere. It was literally an adventure. And the amazing thing is when I was in Hong Kong, my window would look out over Hong Kong Harbour, and I would see planes flying in. And one time I actually saw the Concorde. I'm not sure if you've seen a Concorde. I saw it fly actually out of Hong Kong Airport with its afterburners on. And I also saw it one time sitting on the tarmac, a very small plane actually, if you haven't seen one, but absolutely fascinating. And you see the nose there, it's pointing down for the pilot to be able to land in Hong Kong. That's a picture of Hong Kong right there. Not only this, we have the amazing F-35s, these incredible planes that network with each other. Not only can the pilots talk to each other when they're in formation, but the planes, the machines themselves talk to each other. And of course, you might be saying, well, how do these planes fly? They're so heavy. And the reality is, as Nathan would be able to explain, it has to do with the aerofoil shape of the wings. Because of the wing shape, there's a lower pressure above the wings and a higher pressure below, which actually means as the plane's flying, the wings are effectively, there's a lift, as we would say. And this is the thing which really fascinates me. Imagine that, we could study science and we could learn about how planes fly, how aerofoils actually allow us to lift off into the air. It's brilliant. And not only that, as a young person in Hong Kong, I loved chemistry as well. You know, blowing up the chemistry lab, as they would say, the cliche. But it's incredible. You know, that old period, well, not the old, it's very current as well, but the periodic table, you just look at that and you go, this is marvelous. Incredible, just the arrangement, the structure of all of the elements in our, not only our world, but in our universe as well. And if you go to just one of the most simplest of molecules, you'll see that there's a special arrangement, a special structure. The oxygen atom needs 2 electrons to be stable, and the 2 hydrogen atoms provide those 2 electrons. And for me, this is, I still love the very thought of science. It's absolutely amazing. Another thing I really loved was the circulatory system with the heart and the blood flowing around. And of course, you would be well aware that the heart pumps through electric signals, electric pulses, which kind of wrap around that organ and sends your blood pumping through your body. Fascinating things. It was just brilliant to be able to study. But here's the rub, if I could put it this way. If you were to go down to the University of Melbourne or the University of Sydney or the University of Toronto, Stanford University, and if you were to go to the science section of the library, and you were to go through all of those books, the solid, you know, the weighty scientific books, you would find no mention of God at all. There might be some books, you know, by Richard Dawkins and the others, you know, the Selfish Gene, the Blind Watchmaker, you know, books along those lines, but they're probably in a different section. The books on science won't mention God, not in any significant way at all. And so we have to wonder, we have to think about this. I want to tell you a bit of a story. It's about a French scientist, a polymath, called Pierre Laplace. And he was very fascinated with astronomy and cosmology as well. And he wrote a book, a very thick book, called the Traité de Mécanique Céleste. And he explained how the solar system worked. And of course, for anybody who's written a book, you want to get it published and well known. So Laplace took this book to Napoleon, and to give it to the emperor, Napoleon. And Napoleon was a little bit cheeky. He liked to kind of make people embarrassed. So when Laplace handed him the book about the solar system, and Napoleon had a bit of a flick through it, Napoleon turned to Laplace and he said, "Monsieur Laplace, they tell me you've written this large book on the system of the universe and have never even mentioned its creator." He wanted to embarrass Laplace. And Laplace stood up even more straightened his shoulders, and said back to Napoleon, "Je n'avais pas besoin de cette hypothèse-là." And for those of you who know your French, what he said was this: I had no need of that hypothesis. I could explain the entire solar system without even mentioning God. To the embarrassment, shall I say, he came back to bite Napoleon. But you know, it's an incredible thought. If science can explain everything, where does that leave God? Where does it leave God? Because, you know, science is such a successful enterprise. It's been so incredible. You know, we have the F-35 planes. We understand the circulatory system, but where does that leave God? And if a little bit more deeply, if science can explain everything, then maybe God does not exist. Maybe science has buried God. It's a very important, significant question. And for those of us who are believers, that can be challenging. For those of us who are more skeptical or atheistic, then you might be quite positive about this idea, because you would say that we can now move on from these superstitious ideas about gods and what they do in the world. We can just look for the physical explanations, the scientific explanations. So what I want to do is I just want to dive into science a little bit more deeply. One of the goals of science is to find the order, the structure, the patterns which occur in nature. And these are just some of the patterns that you can see, and they're incredible. Science is looking to explain these. And in particular, if you look at the beehive there, the honeycomb, you see that hexagonal shapes there, which for anybody of you who loves maths, it's just absolutely incredible, absolutely amazing that would appear in nature. Now, the fascinating thing is that there's also an order underlying the universe. There's a structure to the universe, the large space-time structure. Now, of course, we can only see a small part of the universe, the observable universe. It's about 93, 94 billion light years across. So we can't see beyond that. And there's parts of the universe that we'll never be able to see. That's outside our light cone. But what we do as scientists or people interested in science, we look at this order and we say that this underlying order is something which is a property of the universe, which extends way beyond what we can see and allows us to understand the universe. It's a very important part of science. So that's the first part of science. Now, there's another very important fundamental aspect to science, and that is our brain. Our brain is about 1.5 kgs of matter. It has a consistency, something like tofu, so quite soft. And in there's 86 billion neurons. There's a varying numbers, but it's in the order of billions, hundreds of billions of neurons. And one of the best results that I've seen is the 86 billion neurons. And that is really, really incredible. When you think about it, the ability of the human mind to be able to understand and to learn and process. Now, here is the challenge. How can our small brains understand the universe? Think about that. How can our small brains understand the universe? This is the two basic fundamental requirements of science, if I could put it that way. Now, if I was to turn to one of the most famous scientists of all times, Albert Einstein, who derived that equation E equals mc squared, also the general theory of relativity as well. One of the things he said was this: the eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. The fact that it is comprehensible is a miracle. The fact that our small minds can understand the universe is a miracle, is what he said in the Franklin Institute Journal in 1936. And it was not only Einstein, also Charles Darwin. He wrote a letter to William Graham on the 3rd of July, 1881. And he said this: "But then with me the horrid doubt always rises, whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, according to his theory, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?" And this doubt, this horrid doubt that he articulated is actually very, very important to think about. If our minds, if our brains evolved, why would we trust our brains? Why would we trust the thoughts in our mind? It really pulls the rug out from our thinking, from the trustworthiness of our thinking. Let me just kind of put this in a bit of context. This is Melbourne, and if you look down there, you might be able to see some of your friends if you live in Melbourne, but they're pretty small. If you're flying a plane, one of the planes that Nathan flies, by the time you're at this altitude, people are looking a bit more like ants down there. But let's take it a bit further. If we were to take a ride in the Virgin Galactic, somewhere down there you can see Melbourne, for those of you Melburnians. But now you and I, if you live in Melbourne, we just cannot be seen at all. And take it out even further to the entire solar system, not to say the universe. The reality of it is this, that as human beings, our existence, the scope of our reality is microscopic, nanoscopic in many ways to the entire universe. So to think that we could understand the universe being that small is absolutely incredible. And C.S. Lewis put it really well. He said, supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind, in that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It's merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen for physical or chemical reasons to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives me as a byproduct the sensation I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course, I can't trust the arguments that are leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else, for that matter. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought. So I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. And he goes on in the book Miracles, unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. So when we start to think through this, what we recognize is that that question of the comprehensibility of our world, of the universe, is an entire mystery. It looks like a miracle to someone who is studying science. But from a theistic point of view, we can recognize that the existence of God is a powerful explanation of this incredible convergence, that God created the universe, but he also created our brains so we could understand it. Absolutely brilliant. The theistic position grounds science in a way that naturalism, atheism just cannot. And so the fact that we can do science is evidence that God exists. And this is so amazing, so profound, that instead of being something which buries God, in fact, science is built on the foundation of God and his thought and his creativity as well. It's absolutely amazing. You know, I just want to run through some of the reasons that science points towards God, the origin of the universe. God is the original cause of the universe. The universe had a beginning, and that God is the cause of that. Also, when we look at DNA, we find that DNA has letters, A, C, G, T, as you would know. And those letters are combined to form genetic words and genetic information. And if we were to go down to the beach and find a message on the sand, you and I would know from our experience that that information could never have arrived there through the action of winds and waves. Physical processes do not lead to information. And as we talked about on Thursday night, genetic information is points towards God as the origin of that source of information, of new genetic information. God's signature in your cell, every cell of your body, points towards the existence of God. We also have the flagellum, this tiny cell motor, which is absolutely incredible. It truly looks like an outboard motor. And the best explanation for this is intelligent design. Also, the blood clotting mechanism, incredibly intricate system in our bodies to protect us from bleeding to death because of cuts. And Professor Doolittle, amazing name, he actually said that the origin of the blood clotting mechanism is an incredible mystery to him, even though he's a world expert in the system. It's so intricate that you have to have, it's like this Goldbergian kind of system where everything needs to be in place. It's like a chain. It's like those mousetraps with things that need to fall into place. And if you don't have the whole system, it simply won't work, or the blood will clot too early. It's an incredible, incredible system. The other thing I want to draw to your attention as well is the beautiful reality of heterosexual reproduction. It's the reason why all of us are sitting here or online today, able to participate in this presentation. But we have to ask ourselves, where did that come from? And heterosexual reproduction is a mystery. I remember talking to a marine biologist about dolphins, and the fact is that dolphins actually enjoy sexual intercourse, relationships, and I asked her, how did it evolve? And she was, in using a very colloquial term, stumped. She literally said there's no known mechanism or process for doing this. Now, evolutionary scientists can say, well, it gives us a survival advantage, but that has not explained it. It has not given us the process through which heterosexual reproduction came into existence. I want to take you back and to this question, because we're looking at the relationship between science and faith, and in particular for this presentation between science and the Bible. We look at neo-Darwinian evolution, the Big Bang, the old Earth, the 4.54 billion year old planet that we live on according to geological dating models. And the question is, why does science diverge from the Bible? Why does science diverge from the Bible? And I want to just dive into this for the remaining minutes that we have together. There's a very famous cartoon where a young or a middle-aged, probably is a better word of describing him, researcher works out a solution to a mathematical problem. And then he excitedly calls his supervising professor or the head of department to come in and check out his work. So the old professor works through the equations very carefully in the cartoon, and then comes to this step here where it says, then a miracle occurs, and he stops and pauses, and you can see him just kind of tapping on the blackboard there. Or I guess a whiteboard these days. And he, in a very humble way, he says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. I think you need to be more explicit here in step 2. Not arrogantly, but just there's a little bit more work to be done here. Really interesting. And what he's really saying is this. So he's saying, we cannot include miracles in science. That is the underlying assumption that is occurring there. It cannot be part of our explanations. It takes me to a very, very famous quote by Richard Lewontin, where he said this: our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories. And I'll just pause on that. That's what would often be used with regards to heterosexual reproduction and the blood clotting mechanism, unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to the material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. The eminent Kant scholar Louis Beck used to say that anyone could believe in God, my apologies, could believe in anything. To appeal to an omnipotent deity is to allow that at any moment the regularities of nature may be ruptured, that miracles may happen. And this is a fundamental issue. Science is committed to naturalistic explanations for what it sees, for the phenomenal world, as Richard Lewontin says. Science cannot allow a divine foot in the door. But this is the question: if an omnipotent God does exist, are miracles possible? And let me just come back to that comment right there. It says, Louis Beck says that anyone who could believe in God could believe in anything. Well, that's not true. That's not true because of God's nature, God would not do anything that is logically impossible, because logically impossible things are just nonsense, as C.S. Lewis says. So it does not mean that you could say that God, we could believe in anything, which is illogical. But what about miracles? Do we have to rule them out altogether? And this is the incredible thing, is that when we go to the properties of God, we recognize that he is omnipotent. He's also omniscient. Sorry, the second point there should be omniscient. He knows everything. He's all powerful. He's also morally perfect. And these are the properties of the God that we're talking about. And certainly miracles are possible if you have a conscious being who's all powerful and knows everything and is morally perfect, all loving. Then miracles are certainly possible. And what we see as we go through the record of Jesus' life is an amazing supernatural life. We see Jesus, the very first recorded miracle, where he turned water into fresh grape juice for the celebration of a wedding. Imagine that, celebrating the start of a new relationship, a new life, a new union. Incredible miracle that occurred. And because God is omnipotent, this is possible. God can create ex nihilo. We see Jesus healing a blind man. Just think of the compassion. When I walk down the streets and I see a blind person, my heart goes out to them. I wish I could just give them sight, so that they could see what we could see. Whereas Jesus could walk up to a blind person and give them that sight. It's just incredible. It blows me away. And of course, the miracle that we talked about last night, the miracle of the resurrection of Jesus. And we need to go back to all of that evidence as well. And also, the fact is that Jesus has the power to create this world supernaturally too, with all its brilliance, with all its intricacy and complexity and beauty as well. David wrote this. While he was out there as a shepherd boy, also traveling as a king, he said, "When I look at the night sky and see the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars you set in place, what a mere mortals that you should think about them, human beings that you should care for them, for us. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic your name, your majestic name fills the earth. Your glory is higher than the heavens." And right at the end of the Bible in Revelation, at the very center, scholars recognize that this is the central message of the Bible. It says this: "Then I saw another angel flying directly overhead with an eternal gospel, good news to proclaim to those who dwell on earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. And this is the message. And he said with a loud voice, 'Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water.'" It's a call to worship God as creator. And what does that mean? Well, let me just translate that into a more secular understanding, a more commonplace understanding. What does worshiping God mean? We acknowledge God as his ultimate role as creator of the universe and our brains and all of reality. We stand in awe of God's wisdom and power, as scientists do in general of the natural world. We give God the honor that is due to him. If God made the universe and he created our minds to be able to understand it, we should give him the honor, just like we'd give anyone else the honor if they created an incredible architectural structure or a sculpture or a painting. We accept God's transforming power in your life. amazing. If God can do this in the universe, he can do it in your life too. And we also follow God's moral wisdom and directions. Because he's all loving, he's morally perfect, we can really trust him. And David wrote this. He wrote in Psalms 51, he said, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." And then the prophet Jeremiah said this, "I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you." And I just want to give you the opportunity today, maybe as you reflect over your journey in life, as you reflect on some of the things, the thoughts and the feelings which are running around in your mind and in your heart. Maybe you say, "I'd love to have a new heart. I'd love to have a new mind, a mind that is not plagued by doubt, by anxiety, by depression, by anger or fear." And I want to just share with you the message today that the person who created the universe and your mind can give you a new heart today. And I invite you to come on that journey with Fraser, Nathan, and myself. Back to you, Fraser.
Thanks, Sven. And we did have some questions come through as you were presenting and sharing. First one was in regards to the age of the Earth and this idea that if the universe was created and Earth was created and light from stars who are millions of light years away have reached Earth, how do you reconcile that? Just that time difference and that gap. And I guess it's similar to the idea of when scientists carbon dates rocks or fossils, or look at fossilized trees, and they say, "Oh, these are however many millions years old." Does that suggest an issue with the carbon dating, or do we need to rethink our understanding of what existed and how it came to be?
Fraser, that's a really important question, and I really appreciate Marinus and Susanna, Carol, and Doug for sharing that question. It's the specific term which is used is called the starlight travel time problem, going back to the original concept of the light from stars. So the question is, how can light from stars which are billions of years ago reach the Earth? And obviously our eyes and measuring apparatus, if the universe was only 6,000 years old. And so the first point I'd like to make is that there is a number of positions, shall I say, with regards to the age of the universe that we need to consider. So we need to give ourselves time to consider all of those options, if I could put it that way. That's a very important thing. So that would require a whole nother presentation, and we'd love to be able to do that. But let me share with you a very important thing. People will say that the creation model that the universe is 6,000 years old is a challenge to Bible-believing Christians. What they don't know is that the exact same problem occurs in the Big Bang Theory. I'm not sure if you're aware of it. Most people aren't. And let me explain this to you. I'd love to have a whiteboard here, but I'll try and use this screen that we've got here. So the observable universe is about 93 billion light years across. So imagine a ball and we're at the center of it, just for the sake of observation. So that's as far as we can see, right? Now, if you know your Big Bang Theory, you'll know that the Big Bang is supposed to have occurred only 13.8 billion light years ago, okay? So the question is this, is how can light from stars and galaxies, which are effectively 46 billion light years away from us, reach our Earth when the universe has only been here 13.8 billion years. Get the point? And it's a big problem. And this is not widely disseminated within. You don't read newspaper articles about this. You don't read in the popular kind of science explanations. And it's called the horizon problem. And they've done there's many explanations for this horizon problem. One is the inflation period. So not only do you have the Big Bang, where the space-time is expanding, but you also have an inflation period where initially it expands very, very rapidly and then stops. But the problem is science has no idea why the inflationary period started and why it stopped. So this is an ad hoc solution to this problem. There's other alternatives, which is called the variable speed of light, that light used to travel faster and now has slowed down. But the point is if scientists can provide theories on the horizon problem, why the universe from the Big Bang perspective can be 13.8 billion light years old, but our observable universe is 93 billion light years across, or 46 light years away in terms of radius. The reality is that there are viable creationist alternatives to that as well. It's very, very important. So what I'm saying here is that we are not alone with this challenge. The Big Bang theorists have exactly the same problem as well. And so it's a big area, but I invite you to, I'd love to be able to discuss this further, but certainly there's viable explanations coming from cosmologists who are creationists, and they take into account all of the empirical observations that we have. And we need to consider this seriously because it's also a challenge with the Big Bang Theory too.
Yeah, well, it seems like it's coming back to this idea that science is so dependent on this materialistic view that other things which don't fit into that paradigm just get completely ignored without any thought.
Yes, Fraser, that is absolutely right. Because if God is omnipotent, if he's all powerful and he's omniscient as well, then God could create things ex nihilo. So, for example, C.S. Lewis says that it's perfectly logical, perfectly reasonable for an omnipotent God to create a sperm ex nihilo, de novo, in the uterus of a young teenage Jewish girl, and create a miracle, which is the supernatural virgin conception of Jesus. It's perfectly plausible. There's no problem with that at all. Professor Alvin Plantinga humorously says that God could create a horse ex nihilo in Times Square, or down in Darling Harbour in Sydney, or Foundation Square, I think it is it called in Melbourne. Just whatever you want, a kangaroo. God could create it. So the issue with science is, or shall I say the restriction is probably a better way of describing it, is that science is committed to naturalistic explanations, but God is able to perform miracles, create entities beyond that. And that is exactly why we can have an Earth, a planet, which is actually younger than what science would say. Radiometric dating, I should say. Radiometric dating makes a number of assumptions, and these assumptions cannot be verified going way back 4.54 billion years ago. And that is where the real problem lies. We're coming down to the underlying philosophy of science, the philosophical presuppositions. It's not just about empirical data.
Well, that kind of leads into a question that Elizabeth and Darius and the kids have asked. This could be a combined effort on this question. But this idea that science has some of its own miracles or events which they too can't explain. And they bring up the example of quantum entanglement. And quantum entanglement, I now know after Googling, is where you've got particles that work so closely together they almost create something new, and they can't explain what that new is, or describe that relationship. Correct me if I've misinterpreted that, guys. So how come science can accept that, but not, creation by design?
I don't just probably step in here and be careful to use that term, science, carefully, because I think all of us are trying our best to make sense of the data points we have. I think one advantage that I have as an open-minded person is that I am open to all data points that come on the radar screen. If there are data points that aren't convenient to my current worldview, I don't have to go into panic mode and look at erasing data points. I can just put those to the side and say, hey, I've got some anomalies here. What would a good scientist do with data points that don't seem to fit the current curve? Well, why don't we try a new hypothesis with a new curve? And I think a believer can hold their head high and say, let's not get stuck on a curve. And maybe even the skeptic could also do the same thing. Rather than being stuck to a particular set of presuppositions, why not have a look at all the data points and say, how is this going to work? Now, this entanglement property for very small particles, I think we should find that to be fascinating, because not only are the particles interacting together in proximity, but when these particles are separated over long distances, it still seems like their energy states and their interaction is still happening in a way that appears to influence each other, almost like a long distance relationship. And I think we as believers and non-believers alike have an exciting opportunity here to embrace these anomalies, not as defeaters to our position or as a way to clobber someone else's point of view, but to say, hey, look, could it be, as wonderful as our minds are, could it be that there's more to explore in the universe? And I think as long as we're exploring, we're doing exactly what I believe the Creator designed us to do. Let's explore.
Yes, and I totally agree with you, Nathan, as well. Professor Alvin Plantinga has made the comment that for the theist, for the person who believes in God, we can take the evidence, and we've got many options to consider with how God could have done it in terms of when he created the universe, when he created the earth. There's a lot of scope there. But for the naturalist, the only game in town, as Alvin Plantinga says, is the neo-Darwinian, the evolutionary paradigm. So in many ways, science, when it's restricted by methodological naturalism, is forced into a mold which locks it into finding naturalistic explanations for those phenomena. Whereas if we were to be willing, as scientists generally are, to say, hey, let's consider, let's be curious, let's consider the possibilities rather than locking ourselves down, then we can really explore a much broader range of options, and we can be very logical and rational about that. And if the universe requires a first cause, and that cause is personal, and that cause is God, let's follow the evidence where it leads.
Yeah. But let's take one more question. This one's from George, and he quotes the Christian Bible in Genesis 1, saying, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Is there a chance that the heavens were created a long, long time before the Earth's six-day creation, therefore being able to be much older than the Earth? So is there an old universe, young Earth? That's the question George is asking. Good question, George.
My personal answer, I don't know. I'll let Sven answer his way, but I personally don't know. I'm open, and maybe Sven's got a better answer.
Well, actually, I was working on a presentation last night and this morning on that very topic. So if you've got 40 minutes, I could whip it up and present it for you. But I know I'd take Nathan's time, and I've already taken some of his time. So yeah, the short answer is yes. That the just like we said that God could create a kangaroo ex nihilo de novo in Foundation Square. I've got the right square, haven't I? Fraser? Federation
Square.
Sorry. Federation
Close.
Square. So God could create miraculously a kangaroo in Federation Square. That God could also create our planet miraculously as well. And there's good reasons why we can for explanations for what we actually see in the Earth, geologically and paleontologically as well. Now, in terms of the universe, yes, that's absolutely true. Now, the critical thing here is that phrase, the heavens and the earth. And my argument is the heavens and the earth is a cosmic subspace. It is, according to Professor Nahum Sana, it is the observable universe, or according to Professor Jacques Ducan, it's the human cosmos. So it's the Jewish mind was very concrete and was focused on what we can see around us. So within science, we know that there's galaxies beyond our universe, or we have good reason to believe that. So what we can hold is that the creation account is a creation account of how God created our world and what we see around us. But for example, heaven, the angels, other worlds, other inhabitants of other worlds could have been created before this. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily it was very old. It could be even older than the Big Bang. It could be younger. But that is certainly a very viable possibility, and I actually agree with George. So thank you for sharing that question.
Yeah, good question. All right. Thanks for your interaction, guys. We're going to switch now to Nathan. And Nathan's going to look at this is such a good topic and so relevant. God on trial, morality in the Old Testament. You know, a lot of people can read the Christian Bible and say, whoa, this God seems so different. How is this okay, what he's doing in the Old Testament? There's killing, there's all these things, and where's this morality that we now see as Christians that we follow? But where is that in the Old Testament? So this is going to be a good topic. I'm looking forward to this. Nath, so we'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much. And I feel very honored to be invited to join this chat this morning. I'll see if I can get my slides up on the screen here. There you go. Hopefully you can see that. This is a very personal topic for me, and one that I have had a lot of time to think about, because I've had the privilege of working with some very intellectual people who really know their stuff and really find a lot of difficulties in reading the manuscripts that I'm going to call today the Old Testament. Now, when I use the term Old Testament, I'm referring specifically to the books that traditionally the Christian church, the Jewish faith, and some of our monotheistic religion brothers of other major world religions subscribe as the books that were sacred, the Tanakh, if you like, or that we look at for the stories of God and the descendants of Abraham. I'd like to just take you back to when I was about 20 years old. I was a mechanic, an aircraft mechanic for United Airlines. And we would work on the aircraft through night shift. This is a British Aerospace ATP, a 64-passenger aircraft. Because the aircraft were in their hangar, it also happened to be a time when the flight attendants would, from time to time, wasn't very often, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, would come in and do their cabin safety training drills. And I remember one particular night shift, I was pretty tired. You know, it's the middle of the night and you're trying to get the plane out in the morning for the first flight of the day. And I suddenly heard this shouting and screaming. These, most of them were ladies, there were a couple of men as well, but yelling at the top of their voice, "Emergency, emergency, evacuate, evacuate, stay down, leave everything behind, get out, hurry, hurry this way." And then all the slides deploy and all these ladies in skirts are jumping off, jumping out the exits and sliding down to the ground. It was quite an exciting adventure, because, you know, we're all us guys, mechanics, we're just in, you know, regular grease suits, all covered up with all of the dirt and grime of the day, and to see all these people dressed smartly doing all of this, these drills, was pretty exciting. I'd like to take you this morning on a particular emergency evacuation of a gentleman who was asked to leave everything in a hurry, leave everything behind, including carry-on baggage, and run for his life to the hills. The question this morning is, looking at the Old Testament, let's put God on trial for a minute. Is he a hero or a villain? I'm very curious what you're going to think of this. Now, there are places in the Old Testament, places throughout the Bible and through history perhaps, where it might seem, and in fact it's even some places explicitly stated, that it seems that God actively causes the death, and you might also argue the suffering of people, perhaps even women and children. It's also interesting that these events are sometimes on a massive, grand scale, almost like involving a whole society or a whole group of people. The word genocide comes to mind. And I promise, for the sake of younger people in our family, I'm going to try to keep this as far G-rated as I can today. But in the Q&A, happy to go into details if absolutely necessary. When I was a teenager, I saw this cartoon. It's Gary Larson from The Far Side, and the caption, I don't know if you can read it there, but it says God at his computer, and there's a little computer screen. This is back in the time when computers were a novelty and they had a big monitor, big CRT tube, and the finger is hovering over a keyboard with the button smite. And the concept that Gary Larson has of God in this cartoon is that poor, unsuspecting people are minding their own business, and for no real reason, one day God might just decide that he's had enough of you, or your race, or whatever it is that you represent, and God's liable to press that smite button, and you won't even know what's coming until the piano whacks you over the head. That's a perspective that is fairly typical today, and as I interact with my friends and family, this is very commonly held. But then, of course, there are the believer type people who say, well, I think God's a loving God, a gracious father that embraces the prodigal son. And this painting here is entitled Forgiveness, showing a loving father or a loving shepherd welcoming somebody back who's had a difficult journey. When we look specifically to the Old Testament, what kind of picture do we see here? Do we see more of a Gary Larson, Far Side kind of a cartoon? Or do we see more of a painting like this one? I'd like to invite you to read the Old Testament with me this morning, a little bit like a newspaper. When you read a newspaper, what sorts of assumptions would you make about the content you read? If you read a newspaper that says that there was some big catastrophe this morning in a particular location, we've been talking about some of the race riots in the States. If we were to read an article this morning in the Australian or the Sydney Morning Herald or whatever your newspaper of choice is, the Dominion, my Kiwi family and friends, what exactly can we conclude by reading the newspaper? Is the columnist racist? Is the columnist trying to get us to hate a particular group of people? What is the bias of this particular author or this reporter or this columnist? When I read the Bible, I'm asking the same question. What's the bias? What's the motive? What's the intention of the biblical author or authors? And in that sense, the newspaper has different sections, like it's got the sports section, the weather section, it's got the business section, it's got some of the stories, the latest headlines. And if I were to read the sports section, for example, to try and get a weather forecast, I hope you'd agree with me that I'm missing something. And conversely, if I were to go to the front page headlines and try to use that to figure out how to invest my shares, if I had any, I hope you'd agree with me that may not be the only source of information worth picking. And for those that study the Bible more deeply, biblical scholars, many of whom are not believers, by the way, they actually use a term called genre. There's different types of passages in the Old Testament, and we need to look at those discerning before just painting it all with a single monotone brush and say it's all racist or it's all the weather or it's all the sports report. the Old Testament is a bit more complicated than just one section in a newspaper. And it reports events that it doesn't necessarily condone. I guess if you look at the passage in Judges, for example, Judges 17:6 and 21 verse 25, it specifically says, the columnist of this part of the article says, this is the time when everybody did what was right in their own eyes. This is not God doing stuff. This is everybody else doing their own stuff. So as you read that section of the newspaper, are you going to conclude that God is telling everybody, hey, let's have a party, do all this terrible bad stuff in the book of Judges 1925? No, the columnist is saying all this stuff happened because this is when people ask God to check out. So how are we going to take that? Interestingly, back in Genesis 6, there is an opinion article here by the writer who suggests that God is really sad. And if we want to be evaluating God this morning, I would encourage us to consider Genesis 6, 5 and 6, where it says, God's heart broke. God was very sad because he saw the mess that his kids had gotten into. With that context this morning, let's just go into a very specific story, but not before I show you an aeroplane picture. I happen to do international air ambulance at the moment. I fly a small business jet that can carry 2 stretchers and a medical team, 3,000 or 4,000 kilometers. We have a central panel here which tends to light up. We hope it doesn't light up. But if you look at that, see that little, those 2 little circles in the middle of the screen, a yellow ring in the center console or center panel, and off to the left, eyebrow panel. These are lights. These are warning lights. And if everything is going well, all those warning lights should be off. There should be no indications on the panel. If you see a red light, that's really, really bad. If you see an orange light, it's not quite as bad, but it's still bad enough to require urgent attention. And I'd like to look at the Old Testament this morning from the perspective of a pilot looking at the annunciator panel and paying attention to those lights. Now you might say, what do I care, Nathan? I don't need to read this stuff because it doesn't relate to me. I say if you are an international captain and you ignore lights in your cockpit, you do so at your peril. And I would choose not to do that. And maybe you have another way of flying your ship. But let me just share with you this morning some intelligence from what I believe to be the throne of heaven, perhaps the cockpit for the universe. Now, this is a passage that we don't often have a look at very often, but in Revelation 14, there are 3 emergency messages that are being broadcast, I believe, from the flight deck of the universe. And it essentially says that there's a big trouble, that things are not going well on earth. I'll just read it to you. It says, I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven, having an eternal good news to preach to those who live on the earth, to every nation, to every tribe, to every tongue, and every people. So that's all of us, right? And it says, respect God, give glory to him, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. We're going to go into a bit more detail this afternoon. We're also going to be looking at whether this claim is worthy of listening to or not. But I just want to make a preliminary comment that there appears to be a message here before something happens. Like the cockpit, where the light comes on before something even more serious is going to happen, like the low fuel light comes on before you run out of fuel. This is a preliminary warning before something more serious takes place. The question in the Old Testament is, does God do stuff first and we get the warning after the fact? Or does the warning come first and then the big stuff happens later? Now, I couldn't pick which story to go with this morning because there are so many really detailed stories that are pretty exciting. But a lot of my friends who struggle with the Old Testament God concept bring to me Sodom and Gomorrah. So here it is, Sodom and Gomorrah. Backtrack. Genesis chapter 13, Abraham and Lot, both very well off, a lot of flocks, a lot of servants, can't figure out how to share the land, so they separate. As they go their separate ways, Lot happens to choose the marketplace. He happens to choose to go to a group of 5 cities where trade evidently would have been quite successful and lucrative for him. Abraham, on the other hand, goes more rural and would have to travel more distance to get his commodities to market. Interestingly enough, as time goes by, Sodom has an emergency. Sometimes even people who don't follow God have emergencies and crises. And Sodom and the cities, the 5 cities, were actually attacked. This is Genesis 14. You can check it out later. They were attacked by fellow brothers of the surrounding nations. They were all related, quite likely, and possibly fairly closely. But, families often fight. And the fighting got really messy. Sodom and the inhabitants were taken captive, and they were, if you like, taken away along with their goods for the betterment of someone else. They were essentially taken against their will. And I can be very confident from the records we have of antiquity that people were not treated very well. And it wasn't like, here comes the limousine. It was much more likely to be ropes or chains. Clothing was very much optional, and the idea of sustentation or nourishment for the poor prisoners was minimal at best. So not a very nice start to a new journey. Now, interestingly, who should come to the rescue of Sodom but God? Now you might say, well, it was Abraham, right? Abraham gets 318 shepherds who are good at throwing sticks and stones. But don't forget that Abraham and his 318 men are dealing with a group of chieftains who have destroyed the armies and defenses of the 5 combined cities of the plain. So we've got to be a bit careful here to jump to conclusions. Now, for those of you that are skeptical, you might say, well, I don't believe Bible stories. It's all a bunch of myths and that kind of stuff. And I'd say that's fine. Even if the story is made up, just for the sake of argument, track me this morning, because I think whether or not you believe the story happened in real life, you still have the same problem. So hear us out. Abraham then rescues the people of Sodom, and he is given a big celebratory thanks by the king of Sodom. This is in chapter 14. You can read it later, verses 17 to 24. Interestingly, not Melchizedek, he is there as well. Abraham is given the option of the traditional, praise. You can keep all the loot, all of the booty for yourself. That's your payment for coming to rescue us. And Abraham, quite clearly here, is able to witness to the people of Sodom. I'm not rescuing you for money. I'm not rescuing you because I'm powerful. I'm rescuing you because I care about you. God cares about you. You can keep your stuff. Obviously, if you need to pay the other people off to help me to do the rescue process, that's their prerogative. But I'm here to tell you that I serve a God who cares about you. I don't care about your money. I care about you. It's quite clear in my reading of that text, and I invite you to check it out for yourself, that the king of Sodom is pretty uncomfortable with this arrangement. He wants to pay Abraham off and feel like the obligation has been met. It's a business transaction, right? Abraham, you rescued us, we pay you back, job done. Abraham doesn't take the money. So in that culture, in that context, for the rest of their life, the people of Sodom will always be indebted to Abraham, and they will never realize how much they are indebted to Abraham, because we fast forward now to the visitors who come to visit Abraham. Abraham, a few years later, we're not quite sure exactly how long, Abraham receives some guests, and the guests come and tell Abraham, surprise, your wife's going to have a baby, which to us isn't a big deal, but to Abraham it was. But then God says something very interesting. God says, how can I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? God comes to Abraham and says, I've been hearing some really sad stories. And this concept, by the way, repeats itself in the Old Testament. God heard the cries of the people in Egypt. I hear some sad stories, God says, and I have to go and check it out. Now, of course, God already knows, but God is showing us his ability to follow due process. God says to Abraham, I've got to go and check the place out and destroy. And Abraham, for the second time now, says, but God, what if there's some good people there? You know, I rescued those people with your help, and my nephew Lot and his wonderful family, and probably the children and probably the grandchildren are all there. Lord, surely you're not going to destroy the righteous with the wicked, are you? And God has a negotiation ceremony with Abraham. Now, my Christian friends today, I won't list denominations or groups, but I'm going to just put it this way, and you can check it out yourself. I'm going to suggest to you that the majority of monotheistic worldview has the concept that God is beyond investigation. God is too holy to judge. God is above and beyond us. God is so unlike us. If he says he's just, we take him at his word. But my understanding of the Bible, and in this story in Abraham, I see God saying, I'm willing to be transparent. Check me out. Am I doing the right thing? I'll even negotiate with you. I believe all along that God's going to do the right thing anyway, but just for the sake of Abraham's peace of mind, God is willing to negotiate. Why not just strike Abraham dead and say, how dare you question my judgment? If Gary Larson was correct, Abraham should have kept his mouth shut. But Abraham says, no, I want to discuss this with God. And God says, no, I want to discuss this with Abraham. They discuss, they get down to 10. If there's 10 righteous people, I will save the city. All right, and I've got a little picture here of Abraham talking to God and negotiating. Hey, what if there's just a handful there? Now, the sad part of the story now is we go to chapter 19, and these two grown men, I believe they were part of the delegation of 3 heavenly visitors that saw Abraham. You can think what you like, but regardless of what you think, the story portrays 2 very healthy, very strong, fully grown men, visitors to Sodom, going to the city square. Now Lot, who's living in Sodom, sees these visitors and he says, I need to get these guys to come to my house. It's not safe for 2 fully grown, very strong, healthy young men to be alone in the city square at night. My question to you is, if it's not safe for 2 fully grown, healthy young men in the city square at night, where is it safe for the women and kids? Where in the whole city of Sodom, in the 5 cities of the plain, where can anyone who is at all defenseless, at all helpless, alone perhaps, where would that person have any hope of any kind of decency if 2 fully grown men in the peak of their health are not safe in the center of the city square? That to me is a question worth pondering. We don't need to go through the rest of the story. I'll leave that to you. But suffice it to say, 4 people made it out of Sodom because they were supposedly righteous, right? How righteous was Sodom? How righteous was Lot? How righteous was Lot's 2 daughters? How righteous was Lot's wife? I'll let you check all those details out. It seems clear to me that God was pretty generous in figuring out who was righteous. And those that were left, I've heard the argument, so what about the women and the kids? I'm happy to go through this with you in Q&A. I'll just make this for the sake of the presentation, however, and that is, in a materialistic world, death is often seen to be the worst possible outcome. But let me just share with you, without too many details, that sometimes knowing what we know about children and women and the way they were treated in antiquity, I would suggest to you that death can be a very merciful thing, especially if it's quick. And I think we have good reason to believe that a whole bunch of people that night were given a very quick chance to go to sleep, and they will be repaid and restored, I believe, one day for the gross injustices that they were meted out. Imagine if God had saved them and they spent the rest of their lives being scarred by what they had seen and the way they've been treated. Interestingly, of the ones that God saved, Lot and his 2 daughters, they ended up being, one of them had a child by the father Ammon, the other one Moab, And in a Q&A today, we might get to the Moabites and the Baal Peor episode. If God had not saved Lot and his two daughters, God could have averted a much greater catastrophe at Baal Peor. But of course, how would we to know that unless it played out? I just have some stories here of them leaving the city, and there's a lot to think about here. Is God being fair? Was it a surprise? Had Sodom been previously warned about what it was doing wrong, or was God just smiting Sodom for the first time just because God felt like it? What's really going on here? I just want to cover a few points in summary. God patiently listened to and honored Abraham's request for leniency. I think that's a very important point to remember. So number two, God also granted Lot's request to spare Zoar. That's the city that Lot went to, even though Lot didn't even use it in the end. God granted Lot's request, knowing full well that Lot wasn't even going to take advantage of it. And we have reason to believe that this place too was also struggling, possibly to a lesser extent than Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities, but these were all grouped together. These were all confederates. Number three, if Lot and his two daughters were the most righteous remaining, how can you imagine how sad was the situation of those that he had to destroy? I can just imagine how terrible that was. My understanding from the Bible, and we can discuss this also if you like, is I see death as a sleep. So essentially, if you want to look at Sodom and Gomorrah, I look at it through the angle of saying God gave a whole bunch of people a chance to go to sleep. Some of those perpetrators needed a timeout, and those victims definitely needed a timeout. So what's the purpose in destroying Sodom? I'd like to suggest at that time there's a relief from suffering. For today, the encouragement that I see is that those who are suffering, there is a promise that suffering will end. Justice is coming. If you are in a terrible situation, God isn't going to let it happen forever. The problem of evil we discussed previously, God will make it right. And this is a warning to you. If you are the one that's the perpetrator, if you are the one causing anyone to suffer, if you're abusing kids or if you're doing things that you know you shouldn't be doing that's hurting people, I mean this in a gracious way, but you're in trouble. Look out, because God's not going to let you get away with it. If you are willing to turn your way, as we'll see in a second, God is happy and willing to forgive you, but you cannot keep on doing what you're doing. God's going to make it right. So there's a pattern I want to bring out here. God gives lots of warning. He always provides a way of escape. I'd invite you to have a think through the stories. Have a think through the plagues of Egypt, or the story about Noah and the floods, or about the multiple warnings. We have the book of Obadiah, for example, written in the Christian Bible, and the whole purpose of the book of Obadiah is specifically for non-believers or ex-believers to turn back to God. Why would he bother? If they're just going to be wicked and destroyed anyway, why is the book of Obadiah in our Bible? And of course, we see that God is consistent, treating people with fairness all the same way. In the books of Moses, we have this comment repeatedly, for the Passover, or when you're bringing your sacrifices, or when you're going through civil justice and penalty codes. Time and time again, God says the same law for the Israelite is the same law for the foreigner. Don't judge people to different standards. If this is the crime, this is how it's dealt with. It doesn't matter who you are. Everybody's treated the same way. And yet, and this is the twist of irony, God tends to be more lenient with people outside the community of the covenant. Maybe in the Q&A we can look at a couple of examples, like the Gibeonites that I talked about at the Oasis a couple of weeks ago. Or perhaps we could look at the ox cart that God graciously accepted from the Philistines, but rebuked Israel for doing exactly the same thing. God is lenient to those who don't know, but God holds everybody to the same standard within his covenantal group. I want to just, close with the concept. God is here to reveal himself to us. He wants to help us. He says he will not do anything without telling us first. God says, I want people to turn. I want people to have a good life, even to the wicked. And by the way, the wicked in Ezekiel 33 here happen to be God's people, believe it or not. He's talking to the frozen chosen here. He says, I take no delight, no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that the wicked should turn from his way, turn and live. And this happens 3 times in the book of Ezekiel. And that theme goes throughout the Old Testament. There'll be lots of questions about slaves, about property, about the funny marital requirements that happen when you annex another nation. I welcome those in the Q&A, but I want to just invite you to think tonight. God is a God who appears to be a one who gives us a fair go. He doesn't do anything without telling us first, warning us, like those angels in Revelation 14, telling Abraham first and helping Sodom twice before finally having to draw the curtain. If God is willing to give you a fair go, even if you and I are flawed and wicked perhaps, is it perhaps time that we give God a fair go? He wants to have a relationship with us. Let's check him out. And I want to thank you for listening. I'll open out a Q&A with Pastor Fraser and Sven.
Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, guys, that's some challenging thoughts there, and good to explore the Old Testament as like you said, Nathan, as a newspaper, and that kind of came through in comment that Aaron's raised in terms of how we can read something and take it to suit our purposes rather than to see what the text itself and the message that text is trying to get across, or any story anyhow. We do have a few questions coming in. One from Aaron. If the absence of God's presence then allows Satan's presence, was Sodom destroyed by Satan?
That's a really good question, and I'm very much open to this one. I guess I've personally have vacillated. Does God actively destroy, or does God stand back and let someone else do the dirty work for him so his hands can stay pristine and clean? And I guess as I'm thinking about this and as I've been mulling it over, I really see both happening in the Old Testament. There are times when God does seem to get his hands dirty in judgment. I'm not proud of this. I'm not pleased with this, but it seems like when Abraham had to kill the lamb, when the patriarchs of old had to get their hands dirty, it seems to me that God too, at times, got his hands dirty. And I see, those of you that may not believe in the flood, but I see that as an event that is historical. It seems to me that God did, in fact, actively get involved in those cases. But there are other cases where God appears to let someone else step in. When Jesus is on earth and they ask about the Tower of Siloam or about the sacrifice of the Jews mixed with the blood, and Jesus says, no, an enemy is involved here as well. So it could be both. My personal opinion on Sodom is that God in his mercy did it, but I'm open to be corrected on that. I think that both options are possible, and I think we need to be open to see how God works in our midst. He said he doesn't want to. God doesn't ever celebrate, hey, I got to smash him today. All throughout the Old Testament, you see tears in God's eyes. And the book of Ezekiel in particular, I didn't get to it today, but Ezekiel 18, Ezekiel 33, God is opening himself up and saying, check it out. Here's what I'm doing. Tears in my eyes. When are you guys going to follow? For your own benefit, not for me. I don't need you to bow and genuflect to me. When are you going to be on the right track for your own peace and well-being?
Oh, Sven, we can't hear you yet.
There we go. Can you hear me now? I think this is a very important question that Aaron's raising. And I do know of suggestions or proposals that God doesn't actively destroy or judge, but simply allows consequences to run their course of action. And so it's more that we face the consequences of our decisions and where those paths lead, rather than God actually coming down to come clobbering down on us like a sledgehammer. And it is a very, very valuable proposal. I guess there is a challenge to that, and that is this: is that since God created the whole universe, and with its physical order and moral framework, then the thing is that you could then step back and ask another question, which is, well, why did God create the universe in this way that the consequences actually occur like this? So in some ways, you can't absolve God from this. God can't step away and say, I'm just not getting involved, because he kind of set it up from the beginning from a moral perspective. And the Bible does, as Nathan indicated, does indicate that there's times when God in his compassion, but with great reluctance, if I could put it that way, does step in. I think the more important thing is there was a interview between Greg Koukl, which I know Nathan has a lot of respect and admiration for. Greg Koukl and Deepak Chopra, very famous debate. And Greg made this comment that the issue is reality. Are we willing to face reality and the consequences of what we do? And we can't really run away from that. So in terms of all of these judgment situations, whether God needs to get directly involved, or whether he allows the course to run the action, or whether Satan gets involved, the question is, are we willing to face this is the ultimate outcome for my choices and actions, and am I willing to make a spiritual U-turn so that we can accept God's love?
I think it's important to point out too here that for most, I've been careful about these generalizations here. We're trying to be fair, but we've got time constraints as well. So I've got to save the time nuancing it all. But for a lot of people, judgment is a penal thing. In our society today, you do the crime, you do the time. It's a tit for tat. It's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and it even appears in antiquity as well as the Bible. But in the reading of the Old Testament judgments, if we read carefully, and my specialty is the book of Ezekiel, by the way, but if we read carefully other prophets as well, Isaiah, Hosea, Micah, the concept is usually not penal justice, but restorative justice. God isn't smashing people up to say, I'm stronger than you. He's allowing natural consequences, or he's stepping in where needed as a training session, because he wants the ultimate outcome for these people to be different. Now, there are people who choose to go their own way, and we do see some very sad, I'll use the word spectacular, not in a good way, events where God finally has to pull the curtains only because people are suffering too much. And I'm happy to go into the detail of blood sacrifice and child sacrifice in the Old Testament times, the Mesha Stele I was going to share with you this morning in some detail. God interrupts only when he has to, because he cares about people that much. And his judgment is usually, as a first preference, restorative, not penal. And I think for us, having this judgment concept of God, we've got to differentiate penal justice from restorative justice.
Yeah, and Darius is raising a question: do we need to look at judgment more like a diagnosis? I'm not sure if you play that analogy out, if that puts God as the clinician, and we're the patient, and that judgment is evidence that there is a course of events that have taken place as a result of our actions, and that places us in a condition.
I'm not quite following the specific train of thought or question or comment here. Maybe the team could, Elizabeth Darius could clarify for us. But I would suggest perhaps that justice or judgment could be a graded or a stepped procedure. Step 1, step 2, step 3. It isn't just like clear blue sky today, boom, judgment. But hey, it's like raising my kids. I start with level 1 and then level 2 and level 3 until finally understanding happens, hopefully. or the child grows into an adult and goes their own way, and I cry because they've gone a way that I don't think is right for them. But to me, judgment in a restorative sense is stepped. It's not just one instance.
Yeah. In terms of judgment, Danny brings up an interesting point, in that the idea of an eternal hell, which is a common notion among many Christian denominations, is a significant barrier for many who don't believe in God. Why would a God force you to suffer forever? And some would say, well, maybe it's better not to exist in the first place, if that's your outcome. And so his question is, isn't this perception of hell one of the dominant issues that distorts God's character? And how do we address this when a lot of other major Christian denominations try to defend a God that sends people to hell forever?
You want to address that with Sven, or I'm happy to if you'd rather?
Yeah, quick comment. Yes, look, I think that's a very serious issue, and it's a serious issue with historical theology in the Christian church. And my response would be that the eternal hell actually arises out of Greek dualism and not holistic Hebrew thought. And once we say that, look, I personally don't believe in that picture of God. That we don't personally, I don't see it in the Bible, and so we can explore more accurate pictures of God. So that's a really important question that Danny has raised. He also continues on with this idea, why would God create beings that may end up in terrible places like hell or judgment? And that's a very, very big question as well. And Nathan, I've got some thoughts on that, but did you want to focus on that part of the question?
I think the best way for me to understand God's character is to look at the stories about God in the Old Testament. And one particular story that comes to mind is the story of the Gibeonites that I shared 2 weeks ago. I won't rehash that one now, but I'm happy to if someone asks. Another story of interest is Numbers 31, where Moses is commanded by God to strap on the swords and go and kill everybody, men, women, and children. Now, my atheist friends bring this passage up again and again and again. Look, Nathan, what are you going to do with this? And I guess that'd be my question for you. What would you do with that? My suggestion would be to take it on. Have a look. Read the story. Look at Numbers 31, but go back to Numbers 25. Go back to Exodus 2, 3, 4, and then go to Numbers 31. What's going on here? Why is the strapping on of the swords and the killing of women and children so important? It seems that we are very quick to jump in and say, that's good or that's bad. But we're not very eager to actually do a bit of homework. When an aircraft crashes, we have what's called an accident investigation. We spend usually 12 months going through the record. And in the first day or two, people are very quick to say, oh, it was pilot error, or it was the weather, or it was, so-and-so did such and such. But really, if we're going to be credible, if we're going to help the aviation industry, if we're going to be a part of the solution rather than just the Monday morning football coaches after the game's been played, we need to take the time seriously to look at the data points. And I invite my friends, if you're a non-believer or a believer, you got a question, do the right thing and investigate it. If you're stuck, happy to help. But the evidence is pretty clear that God never has anybody strap on a sword until there's the very last resort. And the details before that last command are often skimmed at the peril of the investigation.
I think it also has to do with the concept that God is willing to take the risk, with us as free, moral, and conscious agents. That things may go wrong, as it did with Lucifer, according to the Bible. But God wants to have a relationship with us, and part of this whole process with morality and the reality of evil is that God didn't want to just say, I'm not going to take this this creation on, just because there's potential challenges or people may reject me along the way. So God's takes on big risk, I'd say.
And I think that, perhaps that speaks to what Nathan was talking about before, about the transparency of God. If you were a dictator, you would orchestrate events that there could be no questioning, or there could be no raising of questioning of your character. But God has not, in the stories that we've looked at, and you read through the Christian Bible, there is plenty of opportunity there to question what God is like, and he, as I've read it and I've come to understand it, he continually just provides opportunity to reveal who he is, and provide that transparency, which to me speaks to what kind of person God is like, that what kind of the characters of God, I should say.
Time and time again throughout, I'm just for example, I got Isaiah chapter 1 verses 10 to 20 here, for example. God seems really frustrated. And for my non-believing friends or my believing friends tuning in today, you might be interested to know, why is God frustrated? Is it because people aren't paying enough tithe? Is it because they're not giving offerings? Is it because they're not doing all this genuflecting and bowing? What is it that God is frustrated about? And Isaiah chapter 1, 10 to 20 makes it clear that God is frustrated because people are mistreating other people. Because people are coming with these religious forms and ceremonies. In fact, if you're a non-believer today, this passage, you can use it and whack us over the head with it, because it's against us and it's in your favor. God is sick of religious formalism. He's sick of these sacrifices. He's sick of all this pretend church religious stuff. He's asking us, why can't we be doing the honorable thing by our neighbor, especially those who are the orphans and the widows? Those two phrases, if you want to do a bit of a Bible search for orphans and widows, time and time again, the prophets are mad with God's people because they don't care about the orphans and the widows. And in fact, the prophets are killed again and again, or put in prison or mistreated, because the people don't want to hear about social justice. They don't want to hear about not being able to charge interest to those who can't afford to pay it back. And yet that's exactly who God's fighting for. So if you're looking for someone to fight for your cause today, it's Yahweh. It's the God of the Old Testament. He's the one calling justice to account. And if we're not sure if God's being just, as I said, Ezekiel 18 and Ezekiel 33 specifically reveal God's terms for justice. He is begging us to compare his level of justice with our level of justice and to decide. So it's just a matter of us checking out the data points. I think we're a bit lazy sometimes and just have this big broad brushstroke because we don't really want to figure it out for ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the big things that Nathan and Fraser and I have been really heading towards, I guess, is that we do have freedom of choice, which is truly amazing. Freedom of choice comes in with the morality. It comes in with science and rationality, but also with our relationship with God as well. And what we would like to do today is, this is our final kind of formal presentation. This afternoon we have a practical workshop with Nathan about how to use some of this material and to grow in that area in your relationships. And we would like to give you a choice as well. I'm just going to put a URL up on the chat line there, and it's a link to a response form, a card that we have put together, just a short card. And let me just lead you through that. So you just click on it, open another window in your browser, or get out your smartphone and type it into your smartphone, tinyurl.com/try God. And if you go to that, you'll be taken to a form where you have the opportunity to respond, to choose. And we'd love to continue this journey with you. In many ways, we've just been able to touch the surface. So if you would like to choose to head down further down this pathway with us to learn more about the character of God and the difference that he can make in your life. We'd just like to invite you to do that. So if you go to that card, you'll find the form there, I should say. You can just share with us how we can get in touch with you, how we can build a friendship where we can dive deeper into these topics. And down below, there's a number of different responses. And you can choose any of them or a number of them which you feel really makes sense to you and you'd really be honestly interested in. So the first one is, I'd like to give God a chance in my life. That was the message of Nathan just now. I'd like to give him a go. He's given us a chance. What about if we give him a chance as well? Number two, I would like to learn, sorry, there's a missing two. I'd like to learn more about God's relationship with science. That goes back to my presentation. And if you have a real fascination with science, and perhaps you could have worked out from my passion and the responses that I really do love science, that may be something that you'd like to explore together with Nathan and Fraser and I. The third one, we've really focused on the life of Jesus. And so we want to give you this choice as well. If you would like to explore more deeply the life and message of Jesus Christ, I've actually put together a video series called the I Am series, and you could do that together with us as well. The final message or the invitation from my presentation was that the same God who created the universe and created your mind and DNA and all of the amazing things that we see around us in the ultimate sense wants to create in you a new heart. And if you say, look, because of COVID-19, because of maybe relationships or challenges or stresses that you've had, if you would like God to create within you a new heart, we'd like to invite you to choose that option as well. And then finally, in the big picture, if you'd like to start a personal journey towards being baptized, that's a public and personal way of saying, I'd like to make a commitment to entering into the new life that Jesus offers us. That could be your choice as well. All you need to do is submit, and we would love to continue this journey with you. So make sure you take that opportunity because we'd love to journey with you as well.
Absolutely. Folks, that brings us to the end of this session. We just want to thank you for joining us on this journey. This afternoon at 2:30 p.m. we get practical, and if the focus is going to be on just how to engage in dialogue and have discussions and do so with integrity, with humility, with respect, but also with an intention and with purpose. So if that's something that interests you, we'd love to have you with us. This is where the rubber meets the road, so please join us at 2:30 p.m. The links for this will be on YouTube. What I'll do is we'll send out an email this week with all the links so you can catch up on them or share them if you know someone who wants to do it, or just maybe go through it again and take some notes. And the other thing is we'll send out a PDF with kind of just a summary of what we looked at, so you've got it on hand and you can refer back to it. And there'll be some recommended reading and useful resources in that as well. But we just hope this has been helpful for you and clarified some questions. And we just look forward to continuing this journey with you as you continue to grow and discover and ask questions and explore. So thank you. And that's bye from us.
See you. Bye-bye.
See you, everyone. Really good to join you.